what sort of spin are you putting on the earthquake fault question?
You want me to answer that, or shall I?
I'll happy to answer it. This area is the most studied area in Los Angeles, by far. It has had multiple trenches developed on site. There are a variety of, besides trenches, there have been what's called cone petrometer tests, there have been borings, there has been everything on every single corner. And what they've done is they've done so much investigation that they've created the most comprehensive map, geological maps through this area to find exactly what's happening and where the faults, if there are any, where they are trending and what's there and what's not, and how old they are. There have been faults found on these properties, however, all of them are not active. They are all in the age of around 100 to 150,000 years old. Under California law, a fault is deemed to be not active after 11,000 years. And so there isn't a fault that has been found on any of these properties or these properties that is an active fault. There is speculation on where the fault has gone. And
what is the speculation?
The speculation is twofold. One is that there is a strand that comes up from Cahuenga and actually comes this way in the middle of the freeway. There's another offshoot of it that comes up into the hill part here, and they don't know if one is somewhere in here. They haven't really investigated because they haven't been able to get under the DWP building.
But it also depends on who you listen to, because the state says something different than...
The state, let me explain what the state has said, and I deal with the state all the time on this issue. So what the state has said is they have inferred, they have not done one of their own studies. You have to understand that. What they have done is they took surface studies previously, they've taken other data points that people have done, and they've created a zone that requires further study to be done in that zone. Then, once that is done, they're done. They say, these are our zones, this is where we see, or we believe the faults are. As we've developed all these data on these various sites, the state, as they come back in their revision to that zone, they're doing two things. One is they're creating a Whittier fault zone that's going to come through downtown and they believe connect to the Hollywood fault zone. And they're doing a Santa Monica fault zone that will start basically at La Brea and start going west all the way to the beach. They believe all of these underground systems interconnect. And they are planning and will revise this map based upon the thorough data that we have now that everyone has done. And we have, except for the blue site, and except for this, every one of these sites has had trenching done and has had substantial subsurface done. And the state has to reflect that in their new study because they have to reflect the actual studies that have been done. And because of that, they will move that line.
So let me just give you one further thing. So usually when someone tells you you have to do a fault study, they ask you to dig a trench from, in this case, from north to the south end of the property to catch any potential fault that would go through 10 to 15 feet
At least.
deep. In our case, what happened is the city, we did that. We gave them the results. The results were we had old faults, as Jerry said, in excess of 150,000 years. The city said, well, we want you to dig another fault, which we did over here somewhere.
So yes, so we started with a trench on Argyle. So we dug a trench along Argyle because we had heard about what was going on these properties, and so we wanted to ensure that there wasn't any.
Millennium, you're talking about Millennium.
Millennium and what was known as 2nd Street.
Okay.
So a trench was dug here. There were these old faults found. What they discovered, I'm now a geology geek, this was an ancient sea cliff. Right? So, and this is the high point of the cliff. So all of the sediment was washing off it. So there was no young soil on top of this. You had old rocks that were geologically very, very old into, like I said, 150,000 years old. What the city said after Bob found that out, they said, we can't tell whether that crack in that 150,000-year-old rock is new or old because there's nothing to judge it above it. So how do we know? So they made us dig another trench here, and then other trenches here, trying to trace down that sea cliff to determine when could we find sufficient soil so that they could say positively that these faultings were not active, right? And so as we came down, as you come down the sea cliff, you start finding more and more soil that is of ages. And ultimately, we found out that this fault continued, the same faulting that's here did continue across the property, and ultimately was buried by soil that was 150,000 years and younger. And so that is determinative to them and to the state that since none of those soils were disrupted, that same fault line coming through the property has not been fractured for over 150,000 years.
But in all due respect, you're taking the city's line, and those of us who live in this neighborhood, I bought my house in 1976 on this hill, so I've lived here a long damn time. And the city decided about 20 years ago that it was going to develop Hollywood.
Well,
And it's been pushing to do so, and I don't trust any study. It was part of the metro line, it's part of, I mean, I have Antonio Villaraigosa look me in the eye and hold my hand and tell me that he was going to develop the metro line, and he was going to do it no matter what anybody told him.
Let us be clear.
This has been the plan for 20 years, and you guys are falling right in line.
Let me be clear. We are not trusting the city's analysis. The analysis was done by, professional geologists, not the city, peer-reviewed, and then ultimately reviewed again by the city. So the city does not make up the facts. And that's the thing about geology. The nice thing about geology is it is what it is.
You're talking about the guy who was from Millennium, who has the master's from Long Beach, who originally said that there was no fault under Millennium, and then he said, after it got proven that there was, he said, actually no, I take that back. It's an old fault, and because of some arcane state law, we're just going to ignore it. With all due respect, the state has not changed their position.
So let me just say this.
The state has changed their position.
The state geologist has said very clearly that he stands by his report.
And
and I believe this matter is going to be settled with litigation. So I'm not sure why you're going to be litigated again.
Well, hold on just a second. So I take issue with a couple things. First of all, if what you were saying was true, when I dug my first trench and we showed faults over 150,000 a year, the city could have signed off. We submitted our report to the city rejected it and said, go back and do a second fault. We did a second fault. We submitted that trench study. We did a second, it showed the exact same thing. The city said, do a third trench. We did a third trench. Then the city came back and made us do what they call potholes.
What?
Potholes. They're manhole-sized holes that go down 50 feet and the guy crawls down and looks what's going on. And we ended up spending about $800,000 in tests to get the city to be convinced that the findings that we had were accurate, that these faults were over 150,000 years old. Now, if you go on my website, you'll find that I built a project in downtown San Diego called Gaslamp Square. And I built it on an active fault area. And when we did the trenching, we had no faults. So we excavated, and at like 40 feet, we found a fault. And we had to go through the same kind of studies. The same kind of studies came back and said it was like over 40,000 years old. And the city of San Diego released us, and we built that project, and that project exists today. It's called Gaslamp Square. I am the last person that wants to invest my money and build a project on an active fault. That would be like crazy, because I would be undermining my investment. If I wasn't thoroughly convinced that there isn't an active fault on this property, I wouldn't do it. Now, in regards to the state geologist, you're absolutely right. The state geologist earlier in the year said that he stood by his report. And he did stand by his report until what we submitted to him were 3 additional reports that were exactly contrary to what he said. And in response to that, the state geologist has said that he's going to amend his report. And he's going to do exactly what Jerry said, which is he's going to try to tie the Whittier Fault to the Santa Monica Fault through Hollywood and tie it all together as one continuing fault. And when he does that, he's going to show that where he believes the active fault exists is way north of our property, either underneath the freeway or north of the freeway. And that's his current position.
I would advise you not to just stick with that and not get into the other stuff, because I think people have a reason for being a little skeptical about the process right now. And frankly, when developers paying the consultant to provide the analysis, the whole process really lacks any sense of independence. And it should go back to the way it used to be, where the city does an RFP, selects the qualified consultants, the developer pays for it, but there is no quid pro quo, as we're seeing now with Millennium and other projects.
I can just tell
I
you,
can't speak to your project, but we've seen it
as I
happen
relate to my
on the
project,
street.
I really feel like I got hosed by the city, personally. I thought I was gonna spend like $150,000 getting through it, and you know, $700,000 or $800,000 later, I'm there. But I never felt like the city was giving me a rubber stamp. I felt really, quite frankly, the exact opposite. Now, before I go on, did I answer all your questions?
Yes, sir.
Okay, how about you?
I'm really speaking for a friend who could not be here, John Abrams. He is actually preparing to go and testify in this general area towards some legislation that would allow the state geologist to be able to block other than just hospital and school developments along fault lines. So when I say what I say, it is my voice, but George's words.
Okay.
So don't get mad at me.
We'll get mad at
So
George.
George says that he mentions the transverse range fault that you were talking about linking faults. Well, he talked about that, but the transverse range would be sort of the master fault, and that the Hollywood fault is a part of, like the 101 is a part of our whole freeway system. And he says that the state geologist says that if a part of the fault is active, the fault is active, and that the Hollywood fault is active, and that the city geologist found a trace of the Hollywood fault on your property.
Not true.
I'm just, as I say, George.
You can tell George that I do believe that there is a Hollywood fault.
Well,
I think the reality is nobody knows where it exists, and I can tell you that I feel very confident with the amount of testing we've done that it doesn't exist on our property. And you can tell George it's